Hello, Warhawks. So today I want to just give you a quick review over some of the key events getting ready for tomorrow's test. So first, let's start off looking at some of the key individuals in this short test, really only covering the Alamo and Goliad. And so on the Mexican side, we're really going to focus on Santa Anna and Jose de Urrea. And so these two, Santa Anna obviously is the president of Mexico, but he's also the commanding general here. And he clearly is the commander at the Alamo. Everybody likely remembers that at the Battle of the Alamo. He breaks up his force though and sends Jose Arrea to take his smaller army toward to Goliad, where there is another Texian army there, and um, and so those are the two different groups. We'll talk more about what Urea does at Goliad in a few minutes. So some of the names for the Texian side is Sam Houston, William Travis, James C. Neal, James Bowie, David Crockett, and Juan Seguin. Um, so Sam Houston is put in charge of the Texian army, and he sends. Well, hold on just a second. Excuse me, my throat. He sends Jim Bowie to the Alamo to kind of determine. He tells him initially, "Hey, I want you to destroy it, but if you think it's worth keeping, then keep it." Well, Jim Bowie arrives, and he decides also that the Alamo is worth keeping, which is what William Barrett Travis has decided as well, who is the commander of the regular army forces there um, at the Alamo. Now, William Barrett Travis did not start off that way. James C. Neal was the commander there, but he had some family issues that he had to go deal with, sickness and things of that nature. So he left, and that leaves William Barrett Travis there in charge of the regular army. Jim Bowie is in charge of his people, of the volunteers, but he becomes very sick and ill as well, and Travis then is in charge, which kind of gets back to that whole idea of the line in the sand. It's kind of legend. There's very likely didn't happen, but the idea behind that line in the sand is twofold. Really, one, it's saying, hey, now's your chance to get out of here because it doesn't look good. And so if you want to stick around, stick around. But the other is almost kind of saying, hey, if you stick around here with me, especially you volunteers that are part of the militia and not really part of the regular army, um, you're kind of agreeing to listen to me now. Is there's a sense of that as well because like I said, they're volunteers. They're not in the army. That once you're in the army, you can't not obey orders without consequences. A volunteer can leave really without consequences, but if you're agreeing to stay, you're agreeing to stay. David Crockett was one of the others that was there. Shows up, and he is commander. Lots of things about David Crockett. He'd been a congressman in Tennessee and lost the election, many other things. He was kind of a celebrity at this time. Shows up there and just says, "No, I don't want to be in command of anything. I'm just here as well to do my part." And then once again, from a well-known, powerful Tejano family there in Texas. Supports this Federalist movement as well. He actually goes on a few different missions. It does not end up is not at the Alamo at the time of the big fight. The Tejanos there that are fighting at the Alamo or that are involved in this war against the centralized government of Mexico that Santa Anna has created really stand to lose a lot because many of the Americans that are there, they can go, things don't go well and they're survived, they can go back to the United States. These families really are risking a great deal, and if they're killed, what becomes of their families if Texas does not win and Mexico wins? What happens to their families? How will they be treated? There's a certain extent that becomes an issue as well, even if once Texas does win, but it's a real issue there. So Sam Houston is commander, William Travis commander at the Alamo. ultimately becomes the commander of both the regular army and the volunteers. James C. Neal was originally the commander. James Bowie, leader of the volunteers, gets sick, and his command goes to William Travis as well. And then once again, Tejano, leader, and just generally very helpful in kind of working a lot of different details, very trusted by many of the leaders, many of the other leaders, himself being one of them uh, during the revolution. Uh, about the Alamo, one thing, make sure you know, understand the red flag was flown kind of to say, hey, surrender or die. If you don't surrender, we will kill you. And if you are captured, we will kill you as well. So they kind of had that warning that they knew this was coming. That is true. That didn't mean women and children were killed, because there were some women and children that were there at the Alamo, and there were even some slaves that were there that did not participate in the fighting, and so they were released as well. So there was a handful, a small group of people that were not killed at the Alamo, but any of those that were involved in the fighting were killed. Um, the kind of the idea here, one of the big ideas behind keeping the Alamo, is that this will be kind of a stand. This will slow Santa Anna down and keep him from moving further into central and east Texas, and slow down his movement towards the Anglo settlements in Texas. And so it does slow them down. It does. But after this defeat, we see the runaway scrape. We see where a lot of people are worried what's going to happen as Santa Anna's army comes through. What's going to happen to their families and things like that? So many of the men sign up and join the army, and many of the rest of the families hurry towards Louisiana in hopes that they can get to the Louisiana border into the United States, where the Mexican army is not likely to cross. Um, excuse me. The final assault on the Alamo starts on March 6th, 1836. It lasts about 90 minutes, which is not very long at all. But when you consider the forces that are gathered outside the Alamo and those that are inside the Alamo, it's also not surprising. The official line is there's probably about 189 Texians and Tejanos inside the the Alamo. Historians really think there was probably a bit more, somewhere between 200 and 250. We don't really know. Those are just the numbers that we know for sure, 189, but probably at least a little bit over 200 men there inside the Alamo. So why does it only last 90 minutes? Well, the forces outside, at least 1,800 Mexican army soldiers outside the Alamo, surrounding the Alamo, and part of that assault. So you've got more than probably about 5 times the number of soldiers that, or no, I'm sorry, about closer, almost closer to almost 10 times, not quite, 8 or 9 times the number of soldiers, depending upon the actual numbers, but outside. Now, those that are inside have the advantage of being behind walls, but they have the disadvantage of being much more smaller, and with less just supplies in general. And so they obviously lose. And those that are captured, Santa Anna, true to his word, does kill any prisoners. The Alamo stands as a symbol of courage and determination for Texans, as a point of pride. Many of you have probably even traveled to San Antonio and perhaps seen the Alamo. Um, so Jose Urrea, we said we would talk about him more. Well, while this is going on, or after this happens, there's been some other smaller skirmishes around, but James C. Neal, or I'm sorry, not James C. Neal. Another person that I didn't mention earlier, but is important for our discussion here, is we've talked about James C. Neal, James Bowie, and now James Fannin. So Neal and Bowie are both associated with the Alamo, although Neal wasn't there. He had been there. James Fannin is in Goliad, and he at Presidio La Bahia, and he is the commander there. And he's been told by Sam Houston to bring his forces and to evacuate. But James C. Neal, time and time again, and I'm sorry, not, I say James C. Neal, James Fannin time and time again, is a slow mover. He does not move quickly when it comes to following these orders by Sam Houston. He moves slowly. He doesn't get his troops moving in a hurry. He and so ultimately to his detriment. And so he is told to leave in early March. I think it's March 11th in 1836, and doesn't actually get his troops and army moving until like the March 18th approximately. Um, those dates may be off. The point those dates aren't important. What's important is it takes him about 7 or 8 days before he actually starts to follow the orders that he's been given. Now, some preparation is certainly needed, but not a week's worth of preparation. And so he's very slow moving. They get going and they get caught in a bad spot. They're caught by Urea's forces and what happens is the Battle of Toledo Creek. And that where they even set up camp is not very good. It's not, and so they are easily kind of surrounded and captured. They ultimately have to surrender, and they do so, but only kind of with this idea, and exactly what the agreement was, we don't know. But ultimately, they think they are going to either be like deported back to the United States as long as they agree to never return, or perhaps be held prisoner through the war or something like that. But that is not what actually happens. And so the men and women of the men that were captured at Goliad or at Toledo Creek are then marched back to Goliad, and eventually, after Urea finds double checks with Santa Anna as to what he wants them done, what he wants done with the prisoners, Santa Anna says, "Hey, no, no quarter. They need to be executed." And so they march them out of Goliad and they are executed. Approximately 340 men, somewhere between 300 and 400. We don't know exactly. Our best guesses is around 340. Although there are some estimates that are even over 400. So somewhere probably between 340 and even 440, somewhere in that range. We don't know exactly. So that's the Battle of Goliad. Obviously, then this becomes a war part of the war cry. Remember the Alamo and remember Goliad. That people, the Texian army uses later in future battles, in particular the Battle of San Jacinto, which we'll talk about starting next week. So hopefully that review helps you. Let me know if you have any questions.